In the autumn of 1898, 3 workers received payment in advance to break through a rear wall inside a counting house on Bornheimer Landstrasse in Frankfurt. The building belonged to the Frankfurt branch of a banking dynasty whose name had appeared in the ledgers of nearly every major European court for the better part of a century. That wall they were hired to open had been sealed for at least 60 years. Behind it lay a room that appeared on no architectural drawing of the property. Inside that room, they discovered 47 wooden crates, a long iron chest bound with 3 different metals, and a folded map larger than the chamber's own floor. Music. 2 of the 3 workers signed a brief affidavit before a notary in the weeks that followed. Both were dead within 13 months. The contents of that sealed room have never been officially catalogued by any museum, archive, or government anywhere in the world. Before we go further, if forgotten history and suppressed records fascinate you, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep pulling threads that the official record would rather leave untouched. Now, back to Frankfurt. The man who ordered the wall opened was named Wilhelm Karl. At that point, he was the last of the Frankfurt line. His older brother, Mayor Karl, had died in 1886. The Frankfurt branch of the family had no male heirs to continue the business under the family name, and the decision had been made quietly to wind operations down. The London, Paris, and Vienna branches would continue. Frankfurt, the city where the family had risen from a narrow alley in the old Judengasse to become the most powerful private bank in Europe, would be closed. That, at least, is the public version. Wilhelm Karl was a religious man. He was also, by every surviving account, a frightened one. In his final years, he gave away enormous sums to charity. He destroyed correspondence. He burned account books in his study stove, sometimes for entire evenings, with the windows shut and curtains drawn. He told his physician, a Dr. Stiebel, that he was preparing to meet his maker and did not wish to carry certain knowledge across the threshold. In the late summer of 1898, 3 years before his own death, Wilhelm Karl summoned an architect named Friedrich Pauli to the counting house. Pauli was given a single instruction: music to locate the original eastern wall of the building, the one standing when the family first occupied the property, music in the early 19th century, and to determine whether anything lay behind it. Pauli walked the building for 2 days. He measured exterior dimensions against interior ones. He found music a discrepancy of about 4.5 meters along the eastern face. There was a room there. It had been bricked over, plastered, papered, and then forgotten by everyone except the man who had ordered it sealed in the first place. That man, according to surviving correspondence, was Amschel Mayer, the eldest of the 5 brothers who had closed the room sometime between 1836 and 1838. Amschel had no children. He was the keeper of the Frankfurt house while his brothers built their houses in London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. He died in 1855, and whatever was in that room died with him, in the sense that by 1898, no living person knew what lay inside. The workers Pauli hired were chosen carefully. They were not local. They came from Mainz, were given lodging in a separate part of the property, and were paid in gold coin rather than paper. The wall was broken open over 3 nights between the 11th and 13th of October. Pauli was present. Wilhelm Karl was present. A 4th man, identified only as a representative of the Vienna house, was present. No one else was admitted to the chamber until everything had been documented, packed, and removed. The map came out first. It was the largest single object in the room, folded into 32 sections and wrapped in oiled linen. When later unfolded in a private warehouse outside the city, it measured roughly 4 by 3 meters. It was drawn on a single piece of vellum, already an impossibility, because no animal on Earth produces a hide that large. The map showed the northern hemisphere across the territory. Modern atlases label Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. A single word was inscribed in Latin script: *Tartaria*. Beneath it, in smaller letters, were the names of cities. Some still appear on modern maps, most do not. The map was dated in the lower right corner, the year 1737. The cartographer was identified as Guillaume de Lisle, working for the French Academy of Sciences. Now this is where the story becomes interesting, because Guillaume de Lisle did exist, and he did produce maps of Tartaria for the French crown, and his maps are still held in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, digitized and freely viewable today. Music, but the map found in the Frankfurt vault was not a copy of any de Lisle map currently in the public record. It contained additional detail. It marked roads where the public maps marked nothing. It identified 5 cities along the upper Yenisei River that, according to every modern history textbook, did not exist. This is the central problem of the Frankfurt discovery. Those cities have names: Camberlich on the Sellinge, Christina on the Tom, Serpanov on the Ob, Tarta on the Irtish, Tom on the Yenisei. These are not names invented by a forger in 1898. They appear in earlier sources, the writings of Marco Polo, the cosmographies of Sebastian Münster, the atlases of Mercator and Ortelius. They appear repeatedly in the official cartography of the 17th and 18th centuries, and then, sometime between roughly 1780 and 1820, they vanish. The cities are no longer marked. The word *Tartaria* is no longer printed. The territory is relabeled. The history is rewritten. The Frankfurt map showed those cities not as ruins, not as ancient sites, but as functioning urban centers. It showed roads connecting them, river crossings, fortifications, what appeared to be canal networks. It showed, in other words, a civilization that the official record now insists never existed in that form. The iron chest was opened on the 14th of October. Music it contained, according to the inventory Pauli was required to sign, 11 leather-bound ledgers, a sheaf of architectural drawings, music rolled inside a copper tube, a small wooden box of correspondence sealed with the marks of 3 different European houses, music, and an object described in the inventory only as a cylindrical device of unknown function, roughly the length of a man's forearm, weighing about 7 kilograms, made of a material that appeared to be brass but was unusually heavy. The ledgers were the simplest part of the discovery, and also in some ways the most damning. They were account books covering the years 1798 to 1836. They recorded transactions in coin and bullion between the Frankfurt house and a series of correspondents, whose names the ledger clerks had recorded in a mixture of Latin transliteration and a script that none of the men present recognized. The Vienna representative, who spoke 6 languages and read 4 more, could not identify the script. Pauli later wrote that it resembled, in its general shape, inscriptions he had seen on certain old church bells in the eastern provinces of the Austrian Empire, but he could not read it. The transactions in the ledgers were not small. They involved sums that, converted into the gold standard of 1,898, ran into the tens of millions of marks. The goods exchanged were listed in the ledger margins. Some entries are mundane: furs, salt, timber, iron. Others are not. There are entries for what the clerk recorded as *electrum*, the natural alloy of gold and silver, in quantities no European mint of that period could have absorbed without comment. There are entries for a substance the clerk called *orichalcum*, the name Plato gave to the legendary metal of Atlantis, which no modern chemist has ever produced or identified. There are entries for cut stones of a size and weight that would have required transport equipment, not on the books of any European company at that time. The architectural drawings rolled inside the copper tube were the part of the discovery that the Vienna representative reportedly stared at the longest. They depicted buildings, some in plan and elevation, others in cross-section. Those buildings were not European. They were not Asian, at least not in any conventional sense. They had the angular precision of fortification, but their function was not military. The walls were too thin. The windows were placed at heights and angles that made no sense for defense. The towers were tall, slender, and topped with what the drawings described in a marginal note as antennae of fine copper wire. Antennae in 1798, half a century before Maxwell published his equations on electromagnetism, 3/4 of a century before Hertz demonstrated radio waves, a full century before Marconi sent a signal across the English Channel. The drawings in the Frankfurt vault, dated by paper, ink, and script to the late 18th century, contained engineering specifications, music, for structures designed apparently to receive or transmit electrical signals through the air. The fortifications themselves were star-shaped. In the language of European military architecture, they were bastion forts in the *trace Italian style, the same 8 and 12 pointed designs that crowned old city walls from Lille to Naarden to Pomenova. But these star forts, the ones in the Frankfurt drawings, music were not in Europe. Marginal labels gave their locations, one on the lower Volga, one on the upper Yenisei, one on a peninsula in the White Sea, one on an island in what is now the Sea of Okhotsk. The drawings showed earthworks, moats, glacis slopes, and at the center of each star, a tall, narrow tower topped with the copper wire array. European historians, when discussing star forts, generally describe them as a defensive innovation developed in Italy in the 16th century to resist cannon fire. The angular bastions deflected cannonballs. The geometry was a response to the gunpowder revolution. That is the standard explanation, appearing in every textbook of military history. What it does not explain is why star forts of identical geometry appear in places where, according to the same textbooks, no cannon ever needed to be deflected: the interior of Siberia, the shores of the Arctic, the high deserts of Central Asia, the river basins of the Russian Far East, hundreds of them. Mapped today by satellite imagery, listed in regional archaeological surveys, dated by official sources to a period when no European power was known to be building anything in those territories. The drawings in the Frankfurt vault offered an alternative explanation. The star forts were not defensive structures. They were, the marginal notes suggested, *resonators*. Their geometry was tuned not to deflect projectiles, but to focus and amplify electrical potential drawn from the atmosphere itself. The central tower was the receiver, the earthworks were the ground plane, the moats, filled with water and lined with a clay rich in certain minerals, were the dielectric. The entire installation was a machine for harvesting the natural electrical gradient that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere above it. In 1898, none of this made sense. The men in that warehouse outside Frankfurt were looking at engineering drawings for a technology that, in their world, did not exist. Nikola Tesla, working in Colorado Springs that very year, was attempting to demonstrate exactly this principle. He believed the Earth itself was a giant electrical reservoir, and he was building a tower at Wardenclyffe on Long Island that he claimed would draw power from the atmosphere and broadcast it wirelessly anywhere in the world. Tesla's project was initially funded by J.P. Morgan. It was abandoned suddenly in 1903. The tower was demolished in 1917. The papers documenting its operation, those not in Tesla's own apartment when he died in 1943, music have never been located. The Frankfurt drawings, dated more than a century before Tesla, showed an entire network of such towers covering Eurasia from the Carpathians to the Pacific, connecting, according to lines drawn between installations, to terminals in the Indian subcontinent, the Levant, North Africa, and more faintly in the New World. The handwriting on those drawings was not Tesla's. The drawings were older than Tesla. They predated the discovery of the very phenomena they appeared to describe. The correspondence in the small wooden box was the part of the discovery that, according to Pauli's later writings, the men in the warehouse handled most carefully. There were 31 letters in total addressed to Amschel Mayer in Frankfurt, dated between 1008, 115 and 1008, 134. They came from correspondence in St. Petersburg, Constantinople, Bombay, Bukhara, and a city the letters identified as *Karakoram*, which, according to standard history, had been a ruin since the 14th century. The letters were written, in some cases, in plain German, in others in French, in others in a cipher that the Vienna representative was unable to break in the warehouse and, to his frustration, was not permitted to take with him to decode later. The letters in plain language discussed the closure of accounts. They referred to obligations being settled. They referred repeatedly to what the correspondents called *, the great winding down *. One letter dated October 1821, signed only with the initial K, contained a phrase Polly recorded in his diary that night. Translated from the French, it read approximately, *, the old houses are coming down. The new world has no use for our records. Burn what you must, bury what you cannot burn. *, the letters described in fragmentary terms the collapse of something, not as a war, not as a revolution, but as a withdrawal. Cities being abandoned, records, music being destroyed, populations moved, names changed. The word * Tartary * music appeared in the letters only twice, and both times it was crossed out and replaced with other terms. Russia * in some cases, * the Empire of the Steppes * in others, * territories of the Prince of Tobolsk * in one. The letters seemed to describe in real time the erasure of a civilization and the redistribution of its wealth, population, and memory into the framework of what we now call the modern world. The cylindrical device, the one made of unusually heavy brass, was the last object examined. It was about 42 cm in length, roughly 6 cm in diameter. Music, it had no obvious openings, no visible seams, no markings except a series of fine helical grooves running its length. It weighed slightly under 7 kg, impossible for an object of that size made of ordinary brass, which should weigh about 3 kg. Polly noted in his diary that when the cylinder was placed on a wooden table, the compass in the Vienna representative's coat pocket deflected sharply. When moved to the opposite end of the warehouse, the compass returned to magnetic north. The object possessed a strong and stable magnetic field. No one in the warehouse could explain what it was, how it had been made, or what it had been used for. It was packed in straw, placed in a smaller crate, and removed from the warehouse on the night of the 18th of October. Polly never saw it again. The Vienna representative who attended the opening was never named in any of Polly's surviving notes. He left the warehouse on the morning of the 19th of October, moving east on his own private train. What he carried, Polly never saw. Here the official paper trail ends, and where the story for most historians who have ever stumbled across it becomes unprovable. The 47 crates were sealed and transported in stages, some by river barge down the Main to the Rhine and out through Rotterdam, some by rail east to Vienna, some reportedly sent to a private estate in northern Italy. The map went to a destination none of Polly's papers identify. The ledgers, architectural drawings, and correspondence were divided among 3 of the 4 surviving branches of the family. The cylindrical device, according to a single line in a letter from Polly to his cousin in 1903, went to London. Wilhelm Karl died on the 25th of January, 1901. The Frankfurt house was formally closed that same year. The building at Bornheimer Landstrasse was sold, heavily damaged in the Second World War, cleared and redeveloped. Today, no plaque, marker, or public record indicates that anything unusual was ever found at that address. Polly, the architect, lived until 1924. He published 2 short pamphlets on the history of Frankfurt architecture in his later years. Neither mentions the discovery. In his private papers, however, held until the 1990s in the archives of a technical institute in Darmstadt, he left an unsigned typescript of about 60 pages describing the events of October 1898. In detail, that typescript was the source for most of what I have just told Music U. It was partially reproduced in a German language alternative history journal in 1997, and from there entered the wider stream of suppressed history research, where it has remained in fragments ever since. The two workers who broke through the wall, the ones who signed the affidavit, were named Heinrich Bachmann and Otto Vogel. Bachmann was found dead in his lodgings in February 1899. Cause of death, heart failure. He was 34. Vogel was found drowned in the Main River in October of the same year. Cause of death, accidental. He could not swim. The third worker, whose name appears in Pauli's papers only as Karl, returned to Mainz, refused to discuss what he had seen, and died of natural causes in 1937 at age 76. He never spoke about the vault's contents to any researcher who managed to track him down. The notary who took the affidavit from Bachmann and Vogel, a man named Edward Hirsch, retired in 1903 and emigrated to Switzerland. His office records, required by Prussian law to be deposited with the Frankfurt Municipal Archive upon retirement, were destroyed in a fire in 1908. The fire was confined to a single storage room. The damage was, the report noted, suspiciously precise. The pattern by now should be familiar to anyone who has spent time with the suppressed history of the 19th century. Documents found, documents transferred, witnesses dead, records burned. The story disappears into silence, and the silence itself is the only remaining evidence that there ever was a story. But what was the story finally? What had Amschel Meyer sealed behind that wall in the late 1830s, and why? The fragments that survive suggest a coherent answer, and it is not comfortable. The ledgers, drawings, correspondence, and map all point in the same direction. Music, the existence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries of a working relationship between the European banking houses and an Asian empire whose name does not appear in modern history books. They point at the gradual liquidation of that empire's assets, the redistribution music of its wealth into European hands, and the systematic destruction of the records that would have allowed later generations to reconstruct what had happened. This is the thesis in its sharpest form, music of what is now called the Tartarian hypothesis. It is not, as it is sometimes presented in shallow versions, the claim that a single mythical empire ruled the world. It is the more specific and disturbing claim that the world of the 18th century was structured differently from what we are told, that significant centers of population, culture, and technology existed in territories now described as historically empty, and that the transition between that older world and the modern one was not the gradual progress described in textbooks, but a more violent and deliberate erasure. The star forts are the surviving evidence in stone. The maps are the surviving evidence on paper. The Frankfurt Music Vault, if Pauli's account is accurate, was a moment when the documentary evidence of that erasure came briefly back into the light and was immediately music suppressed again. The people who handled it understood what it was, they understood what it implied, they acted accordingly. What the documents would have shown, taken together, is an inventory of a civilization in the process of being dismantled. The ledgers, the financial flows, the architectural drawings, the technology being decommissioned, the correspondence, the human decisions, names, dates, chain of command, the map, the geography, the cylindrical device, perhaps an actual surviving piece of the technology itself. We do not have any of this. We have a typescript by a dead architect, a few names of dead witnesses, and a building that no longer exists. We have, in other words, exactly the kind of evidence that survives when an event has been thoroughly buried. There are several reasons to be cautious about music, the Frankfurt account. Pauli's typescript was never published in his lifetime. It surfaced decades after his death. The journal that first reproduced it in 1997 was not peer-reviewed. The two dead workers can be confirmed in Frankfurt parish records, but the affidavit they signed has never been produced. The cylindrical device, if it ever existed, has not been seen since 1898. None of this should be presented as proven history. It is at best a strong piece of circumstantial evidence assembled from documents that cannot now be independently verified. But the larger pattern around it is not so easily dismissed. The star forts exist. They are visible from orbit. They are not explained by standard military history. The maps of Tartary exist. They are held in major libraries on 3 continents and can be examined by anyone with patience. The Russian imperial census of 1897 records millions of people in regions that, according to conventional history, should have held almost no one. The architectural style we now call Beaux Arts, the great public buildings of the 19th century with their domes, colonnades, and hundreds, music of small ornamental details, appeared simultaneously in cities across the world in a period of roughly 50 years, and then, after the First World War, stopped appearing entirely. Something happened in the long 19th century that standard history does not adequately explain. The Frankfurt Vault in this larger context is one data point. It is not the only one, it is not even the most important one, but it is the one where briefly the curtain pulled back, and a single architect was allowed to look behind it before it came down again. He wrote down what he saw. The typescript survived. The object's music did not. The cylinder, if it really was sent to London, would presumably have ended up either in a private collection or in the vaults of one of the great institutions of British science, the Royal Society, the British Museum, the Old Wellcome Collection. None of these institutions has ever, on any inquiry, acknowledged holding such an object. This may mean it does not exist. It may mean it has been catalogued under a different description. It may mean it has been moved repeatedly, as uncomfortable objects sometimes are. The map went somewhere. The ledgers went somewhere. The architectural drawings went somewhere. Whoever holds them today, if they are held at all, holds documents that would rewrite the history of the past 3 centuries. There is no public archive in the world where you can request to music see them. That is the story of the sealed room in Frankfurt. That is what 3 men were paid in gold to break open in the autumn of 1898. That is what, according to one architect's private papers, was found inside. That is what was carried out in 47 crates and 1 long iron chest, and divided among the houses of a family whose business for 2 centuries music had been the management of debts that nations did not know they owed. The records of those debts, if they survived, are still out there. They are somewhere. In someone's vault, someone's archive, someone's private library. They are catalogued or uncatalogued, accessible to a small number of people or to none. They exist or they have been destroyed, and either possibility is, in its own way, a finished answer. The wall in the back of the counting house on Bornheimer Landstrasse was opened in October of 1898. What came out of it changed nothing in the public record, nothing in the textbooks, nothing in the cities, maps, or names of the places where Tartaria once was. The world went on as if the room had never existed. The records, if they still exist, lie behind newer walls now. Some of those walls are stone, some are paper, some are the simple agreement among certain people never to speak of the matter at all. We are left, as always, with the fragments, a typescript, a list of crates, the name of an architect, the names of 2 dead workmen, the shape of a city on a map that no school will hang on its wall, and the long, slow music sense, which grows the more you look at it, that the history we were given is not the only history that ever was.